Bonjour, nous allons commencer. Je suis Bénédicte Jeannerot et je suis directrice France de Human Rights Watch. Merci à tous et à toutes d'être venus à notre conférence de presse et je salue aussi les personnes qui nous suivent, qui ne sont pas dans cette salle mais qui nous suivent en streaming puisque la conférence de presse est rediffusée en direct. Juste un petit mot pour dire que je tenais à remercier Madame la bâtonnière, Marie-Aimée Perron, qui nous accueille aujourd'hui à la Maison du Barreau, et ainsi que je remercie aussi très chaleureusement Maître Athias, Maître Dominique Athias, ex-vice-bâtonnière, et qui dès la fin de l'année a mis à notre disposition cette salle gracieusement. Je suis très heureuse d'accueillir Ken Roth, notre directeur exécutif. Je suis très heureuse que Kenneth soit avec nous aujourd'hui. C'est la première fois que le lancement mondial de notre rapport se fait depuis Paris. Il s'était déroulé l'année dernière à Washington. Avec 450 personnes dans le monde, Human Rights Watch mène un intense travail d'enquête pour réunir des preuves sur les violations, les mettre sur la place publique et faire pression sur les gouvernements pour que ces abus cessent. Le rapport mondial 2018 de Human Rights Watch dresse le bilan de la situation des droits humains dans plus de 90 pays. Et dans un instant, Ken exposera en quoi il est crucial, alors que nous observons dans un grand nombre de pays la montée des populistes et des autocrates, à quel point il est crucial qu'une mobilisation et une résistance s'organisent pour la défense des droits humains. Avant de laisser la parole à Ken, je voulais juste vous signaler qu'il y avait dans cette salle un certain nombre de collègues qui peuvent répondre à vos questions sur des sujets spécifiques. Bruno Stagno, qui est le directeur exécutif adjoint de Human Rights Watch, Eva Cossé, qui est notre directrice Grèce, Philippe Dame, qui est notre directeur du plaidoyer Europe et Asie centrale, Andrew Stroline, qui est ici et qui est notre directeur média pour l'Europe, et Emma Daly, qui est notre directrice de la communication et qui est basée à New York. Et grâce à leur présence, juste pour vous signaler que des interviews sont possibles en français, en anglais, en espagnol, en tchèque et en allemand. Ken fera son introduction en anglais avec des petits mots en français au début. Et vous pouvez avoir accès à la traduction simultanée de toute la conférence de presse grâce au casque, et vous vous branchez sur le canal 1 pour le français et le canal 2 pour l'anglais. Et lors de la séance de questions, je vous remercie juste pour les journalistes de vous identifier par votre nom et indiquer le titre pour lequel vous travaillez. Voilà, Ken, c'est à toi.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci de votre présence. For the streaming in English, I'm going to say.
Avec le streaming en anglais, je vais parler un petit peu en français.
D'être à Paris pour le lancement de notre rapport. J'aurais bien voulu en fait vous adresser tout en français, mais comme les personnes qui suivent cette conférence de presse se trouvent aux quatre coins du monde, je regrette que je dois faire mon intervention en français. En anglais, j'aimerais bien, oui. Bien sûr, comme Bénédicte vient de dire, il y a une traduction simultanée et vous pouvez poser vos questions ou en anglais ou en français, comme vous voulez. Tout d'abord, je fais une petite sommaire en français. Il y a un an, lorsque Donald Trump est entré dans la Maison-Blanche, il semblait que la montée du populisme autoritaire était inéluctable. Mais aujourd'hui, heureusement, la situation est différente. Dans plusieurs pays, nous avons vu les leaders politiques, la société civile, les juges, les journalistes et la population en général résister avec fermeté. Là où il y avait cette résistance, il a été possible de freiner la montée du populisme. Par contre, là, il y avait
On the other hand, but there where there was indifference or resignation, the populism has prospered.
Un tournant était la campagne électorale d'Emmanuel Macron. Et c'est pour ça que nous avons lancé notre rapport cette année à Paris. Dans d'autres pays, comme les Pays-Bas ou l'Autriche, pour gagner les élections, les leaders politiques ont imité l'attitude de leurs adversaires populistes, donnant une certaine légitimité à cette idéologie. Par contre, pendant sa campagne électorale contre le Front National, Emmanuel Macron a pris une position très forte en faveur de la démocratie et des droits humains. Il a prouvé qu'il est possible de gagner en embrassant ces valeurs. Le défi maintenant pour Macron, c'est de gouverner en respectant les mêmes principes de sa campagne. Merci. I'll now proceed in English for the rest.
Bon, maintenant je vais démarrer en anglais.
As those of you who understand French just heard,
Pour ceux qui comprennent bien le français, qui viennent d'entendre, il y a un an, il semblait qu'il y avait vraiment une lancée du populisme allait être inarrêtable. Un groupe de meneurs ont gagné le pouvoir en attirant du soutien, en trouvant des boucs émissaires et en déhumanisant.
and by undermining democratic institutions. Fortunately today it's a different story. The threat remains, but the big news over the last year has been the resistance. And we've seen this resistance in many forms. We've seen it among certain political leaders. We've seen it among judges, journalists, civic groups, members of the general public, like the women's movement. And where that resistance has been strong, the real development of the last year is that it has been possible to limit the gains of the authoritarian populists. It doesn't mean that the threat has gone away, but the threat has been somewhat contained. By contrast, though, when through indifference or acquiescence or simply other priorities, there has not been this resistance, the populists have flourished. Now, to give you some example of this pushback, the reason we're holding this press conference in France is because we see the election campaign of Emmanuel Macron as really having been a turning point. And the way to understand that, I think, is by contrasting what Macron did with what a number of other European leaders have done. Say Rutte in the Netherlands or Kurz in Austria. These other leaders essentially decided to compete against the populists by mimicking them. They wanted to become, far right, to do just enough to attract their supporters without becoming them. And the problem with that strategy is that it ended up legitimizing the ideology of the authoritarian populists. Macron took a very different approach. He vigorously defended democratic principles. And he showed that it was possible to persuade the vast majority of the French people to support him over the National Front by reinforcing rather than running away from democratic values. That was a very important lesson. Now, in the United States, we've seen, something related. Trump's surprise election and his entrance into the White House launched a really outcry of resistance and opposition among many sectors of society. And you see this really, across the board. There's been probably more political activism in the United States than in decades. Now, this resistance, hasn't stopped Trump from doing enormous damage. He's done great harm in breaching basic taboos against the overt embrace of racism or misogyny or xenophobia. But nonetheless, the resistance has prevented certain horrible things from happening. We don't have a Muslim travel ban. Trump did not succeed in eviscerating Obamacare. Trump didn't in the end ban transgender people from the US military. Again, the lesson was that it is possible through resistance to limit the harm done. And if you look around the world, there are various other examples. In Germany, the big news was the rise of the AfD, the far-right party there. And it naturally did quite well in the parts of Germany that used to be East Germany, where there really has not been a strong defense of democratic principles, despite the unification of Germany that has been underway for some 2 decades. But if you look within what used to be Western Germany, ironically, the place where the AfD did the best was not some poor, out-of-the-way sector, but wealthy Bavaria. And the reason was that in Bavaria, the CSU, Merkel's partner, did the closest to what Rutte or Kurz did. It cozied up to the far right, whereas Merkel's CSU vigorously defended democratic principles, her CDU. And the parts where the CDU was taking the lead did much better in defeating the AfD than the part of Bavaria where the CSU was in the lead. Elsewhere in Europe, the European Union really, I think, made a mistake during Viktor Orban's rise and his embrace of so-called illiberal democracy. But over the last year, it seems to have learned the lesson. There was real pushback against Orban's effort to close Central American University, which is really a bastion of liberal thought. And then in Poland, where Kuczynski was pushing a serious undermining of the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law, the European Union finally found its voice and has now invoked Article 7 of the EU Treaty to put pressure on Poland to stop this undermining of the rule of law. I think there's recognition here that what's at stake is not simply who governs and how they govern in Poland and Hungary, but rather the very values on which the European Union has been founded. And that pushback seems to have been making a difference now. Looking elsewhere, in Latin America, Nicolas Maduro, through his form of authoritarian populism, has not only violently suppressed the opposition, but has also decimated the economy. And there we saw strong resistance among the Venezuelan people who took to the streets in large numbers despite the official violence that they faced. But we also saw an unprecedented outrage expressed by other Latin American countries. Traditionally, Latin American governments don't criticize each other on human rights grounds because that's seen as furthering a US imperialist agenda. That completely broke down over the last year. And for the first time, 11 Latin American governments were willing to openly and publicly condemn the repression of a neighbor. Now that hasn't stopped Maduro's crackdown, but it has made it much more difficult for him to find the international support that he's going to need to maintain his vicious rule. The other case of pushback that I want to mention is slightly different, but it's pushback against the nationalism, or you might call it the regionalism, the anti-colonialism of a handful of abusive East African leaders who wanted to orchestrate a mass withdrawal from the International Criminal Court. And these are, for the most part, leaders who themselves feared indictment by the court or feared that they had their own reasons to not want to promote prosecution for mass atrocities. This effort to orchestrate a mass exodus turned into a mass fizzle, with only one government withdrawing in the end, Burundi, because President Nkurunziza is basically under investigation by the court. And the reason for this very substantial turnaround was the outpouring of support for the court by African civil society, by civic groups across Africa who said, wait a minute, this is the first international institution ever to pay attention to mass atrocities against Africans. We want to embrace this court. And indeed, many leaders, particularly in Western and Southern Africa, joined in. And it ended up being this attack on the ICC ended up being a reaffirmation of the court. Now, sometimes I think we have to recognize the major powers have been absent from the defense of human rights. Clearly the United States is not a credible voice these days for human rights. The only time when Trump seems to talk about it is when it's a confirmed adversary like Venezuela or Iran. For the most part, the US is just AWOL when it comes to human rights. The UK, another traditional ally, has been preoccupied by Brexit and is not spending a lot of time in its foreign policy on anything else. So that has left an important role for France and Germany to play. But there have been times when others have been needed. So for example, when it comes to the world's largest humanitarian disaster in Yemen, caused by the Saudi-led coalition's bombardment and blockade of the civilian population, nobody wanted to take on the rich Saudis. US, UK, France weren't interested in taking the lead. The government that did lead was the Netherlands, and succeeded in persuading a majority of the UN Human Rights Council to launch an international investigation, which is now underway, thanks to the leadership of really a rather small country that fended off the explicit threats of economic retaliation from Saudi Arabia. In the case of Syria, Russia has used its veto power at the UN Security Council to block any effort to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court. And with that avenue stymied, who took the lead in circumventing the Security Council? The superpower of Liechtenstein. But Liechtenstein was able to persuade the UN General Assembly to create, in essence, a special prosecutor for Syria. It's called the International Impartial Investigative Mechanism, IIIM. And Liechtenstein won by a vote of 105 to 15, a small country playing a very important leadership role. The other case of a small country stepping up to the plate was in the case of the Philippines to counter President Duterte's encouragement of summary executions of some 12,000 drug suspects. Here it was the tiny country of Iceland that led an effort at the UN Human Rights Council to adopt statements condemning Duterte's sponsored executions, and it made a difference. Duterte, in response, ended up transferring anti-narcotics enforcement from the murderous police to a much more law-respecting anti-narcotics agency. So, to sum up, there's no guarantee that this resistance works, but where you do get resistance of this sort from people and from governments, it makes an enormous difference. And that really is, I think, the big lesson of the past year. Just to illustrate this in another way, though, let's contrast that with situations where there has been no resistance, because other things were more important. People didn't want to take it on. And so, in the case of Turkey, where the European Union was much more preoccupied with convincing President Erdogan to help stop the flow of refugees to Europe, Erdogan proceeded pretty much unimpeded to decimate Turkey's democracy and to undermine the checks and balances on executive authority there. In the case of Egypt, the West bought in to President Sisi's claim that he was providing regional stability, even though his crushing of civil society and his silencing of particularly any form of peaceful political Islam is exactly what the jihadists want in order to promote their agenda. Until Netherlands came along, the fact that nobody was willing to take on the Saudis gave the Saudis basically a green light to continue their bombardment and blockade with, unfortunately, the assistance of American, British, and French arms, among others. China, under Xi Jinping, was unimpeded in its worst crackdown since the Tiananmen Square democracy movement, because everybody was more interested in Chinese contracts than the rights of the Chinese people. And in perhaps the most intense violence of the last year, Myanmar, or Burma, proceeded with the ethnic cleansing, really crimes against humanity involving murder, rape, and arson on a large scale, chasing 650,000 Rohingya Muslim to Bangladesh. And there was much too little Western response, really because I think a misplaced faith in Aung San Suu Kyi, who has clearly shown herself unwilling to protest in defense of the Rohingya. But because she was not willing to invite the kind of targeted economic sanctions against the military leaders of this ethnic cleansing, pressure was not put on the military that would have been effective in helping to curtail the killing, and today is needed in order to make northern Rakhine State safe for the Rohingyas' return. So let me just conclude by saying the lesson of the last year is that resistance matters. The only way to limit the rise of authoritarian autocrats is to stand up to them. The only way to preserve the values that the populists attack is to defend them. This is a battle that is very much underway and is very much worth engaging in. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
The press conference is open to questions. You have microphones if you want. We have a team here, hand on the mics. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question, Marc.
Marc Semo, Le Monde.
Marc
Je voulais
Semo,
avoir votre estimation sur le bilan.
The results of Macron, I'd like to know what you think about that. This is a turning point, his election, and there's a human rights diplomacy. He was the president who supported, well, he didn't say a word about LCC. He said, I don't want to give any lessons in the European Human Rights Tribunal. He made a speech that you could have signed in China. He was very discreet, he was more firm elsewhere. What is this sort of human rights diplomacy? What is your judgment of that? What do you think about that?
The question for those who didn't hear at the beginning is basically what is the record of Macron on human rights? And let me, if I could, respond to you both domestically and then in terms of foreign policy. And frankly, in both cases, I think it's a mixed record. Domestically, our biggest concern at the outset was the way he treated the state of emergency. Because rather than just end it, he basically incorporated many of its restrictions on rights into ordinary law without any showing that these additional powers for the police, which already have, I think, extraordinary powers in European terms, without showing that any of these restrictions were necessary. And we're going to have to follow it very closely, but I'm worried that the greater ease with which the police can conduct searches, can impose restraints on people's movement, can close off various facilities, is going to lend itself to discriminatory abuse, particularly against the Muslim population. So we're going to have to watch this closely, but his willingness to simply transfer the emergency rule into common law was a bad initial sign. On the question of migrants, which I think is the other big issue these days, it's been a mixed bag. I guess it was yesterday, Macron was in Calais, and I think to his credit, he gave a very clear message to the police. There is zero tolerance of abuse against the migrants. I don't care who these people are they asylum seekers, are they economic migrants, it doesn't matter. Nobody should face destruction of their shelters. Nobody should face pepper spray. And that was the right message to send. And clearly he was saying it right to the police who had been accused by Human Rights Watch. Our reporting showed that this abuse had happened. And so I give him credit for that. The other, I think the other positive thing in his politics regarding migration is really the recognition that nobody should be forcibly returned to Libya. That the conditions of detention in Libya are so horrendous, with forced labor, sexual slavery, torture, and the like. It's so bad that the International Organization on Migration says that more migrants die in Libyan detention than die crossing the Mediterranean. And Macron, to his credit, recognizes nobody should be sent back there forcibly. What he hasn't spoken out about is the European Union policy led by Italy of doing indirectly what they can't do directly. And so the European Union, and particularly Italy, has been training the Libyan Coast Guard to keep the migrants in Libya, condemning them to the same nightmarish conditions that the European Union says it would never send people to. And so that's That's an unfortunate ambiguity in Macron's policy. We have questions about, he's talked about expedited asylum hearings. That could be good, so people don't have to wait around forever to get a ruling, but it's important to make sure that these expedited procedures are not summary procedures. He's talked about, inviting administrative officials to do identity checks in shelters. Nobody should use an emergency shelter as a place to enforce the law. Even undocumented migrants should be able to go to a shelter or a hospital or a school, have their basic necessities met without worrying about having their identity checked and facing possible deportation. So, as I say, it's been a mixed bag in these areas. With respect to foreign policy, just briefly, you've hit on a few of the negative points. I think that the real low points were Macron's visit to China, where there was barely a peep about human rights despite this unprecedented crackdown. His statement with President Sisi of Egypt that I'm not going to lecture you on human rights, even though the whole point of international human rights law is to make human rights an appropriate topic for international discourse. Has been very reluctant to push the Saudis to end the atrocities in Yemen. And we're also really not sure where he stands on Congo, where France has not been as helpful as it should have been in pressing for the ouster of President Kabila as the Congolese constitution requires. And obviously there are important French commercial interests at stake there. On the positive, to give Macron credit where due, he's been strong on the Rohingya and has actually played a leadership role at the UN Security Council and in his speech at the General Assembly, where others were not doing that. He's been strong with Putin. He's been strong with Erdogan in Turkey, one of the rare European Union leaders to do that. He's spoken out effectively against Maduro in Venezuela. And he's been one of the positive forces within the European Union pushing back against the illiberal democracy of Hungary's Viktor Orban and Poland's Kaczynski. It hasn't been consistent adherence to the principles he articulated during his electoral campaign. It's been partial adherence. And we hope that some of the early missteps can be corrected as we go forward.
D'autres questions?
Oui, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Good morning. Philippe Baudet for Les Echos. In the documents distributed at the entrance here, human rights are relegated to the optional level in Europe. In Belgium, at the beginning of January, the Belgian government deported Sudanese. They knew that they were in danger in their own country. I'd like to know if you believe that this is an example of an optional approach to human rights in Europe.
The question for those following in English is what I think about Belgium's expulsion of some Sudanese to Sudan where they face torture. And I should just say that it should have been completely predictable that that would happen. When you send people back to a country that is still governed by someone who has been charged by the International Criminal Court for mass atrocities in Darfur, it should be no surprise that he might mistreat people who were sent back, people who that actually, in this case, it seems that Sudan had a hand in picking for deportation. So, this was entirely foreseeable and should clearly not have taken place.
Daniel Finnan, Radio France International. Just wondering, Mr. Roth, whether you could make more specific examples with relation to Africa. I mean, there are several examples I'm thinking of. Togo protests that went on for 5 months, the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon, the situation in Central African Republic, the situation in South Sudan, the situation in the DRC. I mean, we could go on and on here. What specific examples do you have?
I mean, you're asking for examples of things going wrong or things going right?
Things that you think are particularly important to point out and maybe looking to the future in 2018.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, let me just mention one other thing that went right, and then there obviously are things that went wrong. I think that a very encouraging part of the last year was the Western African response to the Gambian elections, where the long-serving dictator didn't want to accept that he lost. And after initially acquiescing, changed his mind. And the West African states, as they frankly have done elsewhere, I think the ECOWAS has been probably one of the strongest regional defenders of human rights, came in and said, no, the election happened and we're going to put Barrow in, who was the properly elected leader. And so that was, I think, a very important step for Africa. The problems are numerous. I think the two most dire situations at the moment are South Sudan and the Central African Republic. Congo could turn into that. And we're deeply disappointed that Joseph Kabila seems willing to hang on to power, despite the fact that the Constitution mandated that he stepped down well over a year ago. And it's almost as if his perpetuation power, his ongoing ability to put his hand into the till and maintain his corruption is more important than thousands upon thousands of Congolese lives. And so, the security forces under his command have been shooting demonstrators, and there's evidence to indicate that even some of the, apparent ethnic strife that is reemerging in the eastern and southern parts of the country are instigated by official forces. So this is, really a moment when firm international pressure is needed. There is strong domestic support for an immediate transition. The Catholic Church in particular is playing a very useful role there, but international support is urgently needed. Otherwise, Burundi continues to be a very serious situation because Nkurunziza, himself is clinging to power and is willing to use extreme violence to make that happen. The transition in Zimbabwe that occurred, we're all happy to see Mugabe go. It's just not clear how different it's going to be and whether Mnangagwa may just be, a younger version of Mugabe or not. That remains to be seen. He's trying to present himself as a reformist, but hasn't done that much pursuant to that. I think one interesting recent development was in Ethiopia, where the opposition Oromo leader was just released, and there have been promises to release some 500 political prisoners. I hope that those promises are kept, because clearly Ethiopia has gone about things all wrong in addressing the very significant Oromo protests over the last year. So I could go on, but those are a few of the areas of good and bad.
Yes, Gideon Kutz from the Israeli Public Broadcasting. I didn't find anything, at least in the French version this year, about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Is it because of the ban on visits by HRV people in Israel?
Yeah, I should clarify. This, you all have the French version of this report here. This is, unfortunately, just by reasons of I think, finances, it's a limited version. So I don't know how many countries are in this. Maybe there are 30 or so countries that are mentioned in this. The full report, which is online, has 90 plus countries. So, believe me, nothing of importance is neglected. So in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course there's a chapter in there. And in fact, Human Rights Watch is not barred from Israel-Palestine. There was about a 12-hour period where our researchers' work visa was not granted. And as soon as we made a protest about that, it was reversed. So he is there in Jerusalem at the very moment. So we have no lack of access other than to Gaza. In Gaza, they have really tried to keep international researchers out, and that remains a problem. There obviously are domestic activists there with whom we can work. I'll highlight two issues of real concern in Israel-Palestine. First is Gaza, where the closure continues, and while humanitarian aid is let in, commerce and people are not let out, with rare exceptions. And the result of that is that the Gazan economy is stymied. People, as a result, are dependent on humanitarian aid. And the ability of Gazans to travel abroad, to study, to work, to visit family is extremely limited. In the West Bank, the Netanyahu government has continued to build settlements, and it's worth stressing that the settlement enterprise, the transfer of the Israeli population into occupied territory, is a war crime. It's a violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And the even outside of the settlements, particularly in so-called Area C, which is the area where the Israeli military is dominant, there continues to be overt discrimination against the Palestinian population. And I think, it's one thing to say, oh, this is just, temporary restrictions of a temporary occupation, but that excuse wears thin when we've now passed 50 years. And it's time to recognize that this is the status quo, and we can no longer justify Jim Crow type restrictions on the Palestinian population in terms of their ability to build their homes, to farm their land, to travel. And it's time, if Israel's not going to find some way to relinquish the West Bank, it has to start treating Palestinians equally rather than subjecting them to a forever discriminatory occupation.
Bonjour, Valérie Crova de
Robbie Crova, Radio France. You chose to present your results report in Paris. However, we can't say that Macron's policy in favor of migrants has been exceptional. In your view, can this be called a negative point, whereas you also find some good points in favor of Macron?
The reason we chose Paris to issue this report is really because of Macron's electoral campaign. And we recognize that he hasn't fully governed according to the principles of his campaign. But the campaign was exceptional, and we saw the campaign as a real turning point in the reaction to the rise of the authoritarian populists. So we don't mean by doing this to endorse or embrace everything that Macron has done. And obviously he is not governing entirely in accordance with the principles he articulated during the campaign, although in some ways he is. I mean, it's not like it's a completely negative report card. It's a mixed card, it's mitigé. And so, but our holding the press conference here is meant really as a statement on the way he ran his campaign, which was extraordinary in European terms and really was, I think, a model for what needs to be done to fight back against the autocrats. And what's needed is not to be, autocrat light, but to vigorously defend democratic principles. That's what Macron did. That was what was unusual about his campaign. And it's for that reason that we've chosen to launch the World Report this year in Paris. Yeah, well, I mean, as I said in response to the other question, I think he's been mixed with respect to the migrants. I think that what he said yesterday in Calais, speaking out openly and firmly against police abuse of migrants, regardless of their status as asylum seekers or economic migrants, that was exactly the right thing to do, and it was a courageous thing to do because he was saying it to the very perpetrators of some of those abuses. At the same time, he's been more ambivalent about how he enforces the law, barring undocumented migrants from coming into France, without a proper claim of asylum. And so, we're worried about things like the authorization of identity checks by administrative people in emergency shelters. A migrant should be able to go to an emergency shelter and not worry about being deported the next day. So it's, as I said as well, his view of Libya, which is today the key entry point into Europe, has been a bit ambivalent, like the rest of the European Union. He recognizes how awful conditions are in Libya for the migrants. Nobody would forcibly send them back, but the EU is doing the same thing indirectly by reinforcing the Libyan Coast Guard. And Macron, is not alone, but he has not spoken out against that sort of two-faced policy of the European Union and of Italy in particular.
Juste pour ajouter quelque chose sur sa visite à Calais, pour souligner
in terms of Calais, to stress something in relation to Macron's attitude in Calais yesterday. At the same time, he did talk about these instructions about the abuses against the migrants, and then he also recognized in the meeting that he attended with Philippe Dam was there, and about the importance about the investigation of the IGA. On the other hand, when he makes it understood that the associations working that have provided different information, and it is understood that there might be a threat of suing these associations, that is obviously not the right thing to say. That's not the right path to follow. See, Macron and the government should be open to criticism, and he is to a certain point, but he is also he's also talking about suing some of these organizations who are trying to help the migrants, and so I think that really is the wrong path to follow, and we hope he's going to draw back from it. Question not in the microphone? We had revealed in a very strong manner about the migrant policy since 2015. In 2015, we brought out a report in July talking about the routine usage of pepper gas. And so the reaction of President Macron's and the government at the time was fairly quick, because an investigation of the French activities was started in less than 48 hours. And the results of this investigation show that there are telling points that action was taken violently against the migrants by the police. But in our investigation in December, what we saw is that the routine use of pepper gas, even though that had been reduced, but the abuse of the goods of migrants and the barriers set up to humanitarian aid in Calais was continued. And what Philippe Dam mentioned to the president in the meeting yesterday is that whatever the status of the people in Calais, whether they are migrants or they are asylum seekers, but no police abuse should be committed, and that sanctions must be taken against those police agents who do commit violence.
Interior Minister Colomb continues to be in denial about the fact of the police abuse. And Macron has taken actually a much more honest perspective, both launching the investigation very promptly, as Bénédicte said, and recognizing that abuses in fact happen. But as recently as I think it was yesterday, Colomb was pretending that they never happened, and is just kind of denying the reality of the IGA report. I don't know if he didn't read it or doesn't believe it or what, but it's unhelpful when you have the Interior Minister pretending that something that did happen didn't happen. That's not the way you signal to the police that abuses of this sort have to stop. Macron was much better in that respect.
Thank you. I'm Silvia Youssef from El País newspaper. My questions are related to Latin America. One is with Latin America and the US. Donald Trump has recently ordered the end of the program CTPS, the temporary protection status, to various countries. Mm-hmm. Some of them are in your report, like Haiti or Honduras, but some are not, like El Salvador and Nicaragua. I was wondering even if those two countries don't appear on your report, how worried are you about this decision on Donald Trump, and how dangerous for Human Rights Watch might be this decision to take them back to, send them back to El Salvador and Nicaragua mostly? And then a second, if I may, on Venezuela, you've highlighted how this year the popular resistance and the fact that many governments are more outspoken might stop this populism. But Venezuela, on the one hand, even if more Latin American countries have talked against Maduro, the situation hasn't changed in the end. Is that also somehow an example that not everything can be solved by popular and political resistance?
Well, first, your question about the people who have what was known as temporary protected status in the United States. And these, the largest number are 200,000 Salvadorans who are now in the process of being ordered to return. There were another, 50,000 or so Haitians that have already been ordered back, and there are others, but those are the big categories right there. And for me, the issue is actually not so much the conditions of those countries. I mean, Haiti is not at war now. Salvador is still a very dangerous place. But I think the real injustice here is that these people have been in the United States, in some cases for 15, 17 years. And if somebody has been allowed to build a life in a new country, it is wrong to just summarily deport them. And even though the U.S. could have turned people back after 2 years or 3 years, it didn't. And once you make the decision to let somebody stay in your country for that long, it's wrong to uproot them because people build lives there. They have U.S. citizen spouses, U.S. citizen kids. They have jobs and houses and mortgages. And these people have basically become Americans, but they don't have citizenship. And it is wrong to ignore those deep ties to the American community just because the president wants to make a point to his followers that he's going to be tough on immigration. So for us, the real problem with ending temporary protected status for these people is not the conditions in the country that they'd be forced to return to, but the utter disruption of the lives that they legitimately built in the United States. In terms of Venezuela, you're right. There's no guarantee with any of this. Maduro has shown himself willing to use not only violence in the streets, but also overt fraud electorally, and to go so far as to create brand new institutions of government when the opposition actually wins an election and takes over, in their case, the National Assembly. So, he's a formidable foe, but he's also an incredibly incompetent autocrat. And, he's managed to take an oil-rich country, with some of the largest petroleum reserves in the world, and impoverish it so people cannot find basic food or medicine, and they're, contending with hyperinflation. It takes a certain kind of, completely unaccountable autocrat to manage to pull that off. And that's why, between the ongoing popular resistance in Venezuela and the utter lack of regional support for him in Latin America, I can't see this going on forever. It's just an intolerable situation. So yes, he's in power at the moment, but I wouldn't bet on Maduro for the long term.
Jeannerot from Reuters. I've got two questions. The first one, do you think the UN Secretary General has handled Trump or countered Trump particularly well since he's taken office? And the second one on the Syria chemical weapons. Following the demise of the joint investigative mechanism, do you see a chance of it being revived or another mechanism that can be put in place? Thank you.
In terms of Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, and Trump, I think you've got to give Guterres credit for managing Trump. Trump entered office, essentially declaring war on the United Nations and threatening, a massive cutoff in aid. And Guterres, has handled that well. That hasn't happened, even though the U.S. government continues to threaten different elements of the UN. They've just cut in half their contribution to UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency. And they continue to threaten to pull out of the UN Human Rights Council because of its agenda item devoted to Israel. So, it hasn't been a perfect record by any means with the US, but I think Guterres has been able to limit the damage. I would have liked to see Guterres be more outspoken on rights issues. He's tended to simply defer to Zaid, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who's wonderful, who's incredibly articulate, principled and outspoken, but there are times when there's a need for the UN Secretary General's voice itself to be heard, particularly when it's the Secretary General who is meeting with heads of state. We shouldn't have to see pictures of Guterres shaking hands with autocrats without him saying something publicly. It doesn't help that he whispers in somebody's ear when the people of the country can't hear him, because it's the people of the country who are the agents of change. And they need to realize that the United Nations head stands behind them. In terms of chemical weapons in Syria, we were disappointed by the callous Russian decision to end the joint investigative mechanism and to stop any effort to investigate and attribute responsibility for the chemical attacks, particularly the sarin attack in Khan Sheikhoun. I think the issue now is, how can we revive an investigation? Because I don't know if this is what Putin intended, but unsurprisingly, we've had Assad resume the use of chemical weapons. Just this past week, there was a use of chlorine in besieged eastern Ghouta. So, the poor people of eastern Ghouta, 390,000 people, face today not only indiscriminate bombardment by Syrian and Russian planes. Not only the Russian-backed, Syrian-imposed siege that are trying to starve 390,000 people into submission, but also chemical weapons again. And we're going to see more of that if Putin's answer on chemical weapons is, see no evil. We just don't want to know. We don't want an investigation. And so, I hope that, now that Putin sees that Assad has taken the lack of an investigation as a green light for further chemical attacks, that Russia finds some way to revive an investigative mechanism. And if everything fails, we at least have, the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, and we have the so-called IIIM, the Independent Impartial Investigative Mechanism, essentially a special prosecutor for Syria that the UN General Assembly started. And we will have to look to those to pick up the chemical weapons investigative duties if there isn't a specialized agency authorized to look at them.
C'est Radio France Internationale, la rédaction en espagnol. Est-ce que vous avez quelque chose à dire?
Do you have anything on Colombia, a country which has enjoyed peace over the past 12 months after the peace reached between FARC and the government? A country which and you have the social leaders and the activists and the members of political parties, in particular people who are in charge in the regions for the implementation of these agreements. There's 150 people have been killed over the past year. And also at the UN, 34 members of the FARC, former FARC movement, and 34 members of the present political parties have also been murdered. And also people who, families of former soldiers against the FARC have also been victimized. Now,
killings and attacks on social activists and others since the accord with the FARC. And let me just begin by saying that everybody was happy to see an agreement with the FARC. Nobody wants the war to continue. And the question really was on what terms did the FARC agree to step down? And as you know, the referendum rejected the initial version, and then there was a second accord that was ultimately signed. And Human Rights Watch objected to the first version because of some of the elements of impunity for past atrocities that existed in that. There were improvements in the second version. But the element that I want to highlight is that the FARC signed off on a tougher second version than was ultimately adopted. And what President Santos did, basically in the 24 hours before the signing, without the FARC ever asking for it, was he inserted an impunity provision that would make it harder to hold people responsible under a theory of so-called command responsibility. Basically, commanders responsible for killings or atrocities by their subordinates. And what that was aimed at was not the FARC, but the military, the army. Because, I think as those of you who follow Colombia know, during the course of the war, there were 3,000 so-called false positive executions. These are cases of the army rounding up young men, dressing them in a FARC uniform, and killing them in order to drive up their statistics and get bonuses and promotions and the kinds of things you get when you kill off guerrillas. And this actually happened while Santos was defense minister. I don't know why he did this, whether it was to protect himself as defense minister, whether it was to protect his friends in the army, whether it was to avoid a counterattack by Uribe, his predecessor and ongoing political opponent. Whatever the reason, he introduced this impunity clause not because the FARC demanded it, not because it was necessary for peace, but to buy off the army. And that was wrong. And so when you introduce impunity like that, it is no surprise that the army figures, we got away with these executions. Maybe we can continue with ongoing human rights violations. So I can't, say who is responsible exactly for the particular things you mentioned. I mean, we're doing ongoing reporting, but it is a dangerous precedent of impunity that Santos, despite his Nobel Peace Prize, was alone responsible for instituting.
Pierre Duchesne, La Croix, daily newspaper. I'd like to go back to your postulate at the beginning. How can you explain that many populist leaders have a real popular support? This resistance, is this the resistance of a group that has a positive experience of globalization?
There are genuine grievances that the populists have exploited. And I don't mean to minimize at all the seriousness of those grievances. There are economic grievances where people are upset with being left behind. They feel that their wages are stagnating. They're legitimately upset about growing inequality. There are cultural grievances where, in this modern world of more migration, some people are not happy with the changes in the culture of their nation. And then there are legitimate concerns about terrorism and the threat posed there. So, these are real concerns. The problem with the populists is that they take these legitimate grievances and they use them as an excuse to demonize certain unpopular minorities. And it's almost as if there's no programmatic relationship between the target of their demonization and the original grievance. They just find that it's politically useful to make that connection. So, Trump, attacks Muslims, even though the problem of terrorism is much more homegrown in the United States. He attacks Mexican migrants, even though they're obviously contributing to the economy. There's no real evidence that they're undermining the economy. But these play well with his base. And so I think that the answer to the populists is, on the one hand, yes, address legitimate grievances. We're not saying ignore legitimate concerns by the public. But don't fall into this scapegoating of vulnerable minorities. And it's important to emphasize in fighting back against the populists that you can't pick and choose who gets human rights. When the populists start saying, we're just going to violate the human rights of those people you don't really like anyway, don't worry about your rights, they'll be secure. That's a very dangerous first step, because the structure of human rights depends on them applying to everybody. Once you authorize or empower a government to pick and choose, it's just a matter of time before it's going to choose your rights to violate as well, because something you do is going to be inconvenient to the government or might threaten its grasp on power. So I think it's important to stress that, as a matter of self-interest as well as principle, you need human rights secure for everybody if they're going to be there at all. You can't countenance certain minorities having their rights violated without ultimately cracking the foundation on which the rights of us all depend.
Kim Wilshire, The Guardian. Could you tell us specifically what you would like to hear from the European Union in the coming year? And also whether you have any comments on, now Britain has decided to leave the European Union, what the British government is doing or might do in terms of human rights? Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of the European Union, let me just highlight two dimensions here. One is that there's a need to recognize that what's happening, foremost in Hungary and Poland, is really a threat to the core of the European Union. It's not enough to say, this is just something that's affecting a couple of relatively small countries. If you allow a member of the European Union to undermine democracy or to undermine the rule of law or to undermine judicial independence, you are allowing exceptions to core European Union values. And that's how you begin to eat away at those values. So I think it's important for the European Union to recognize that the threat of Orban or Kaczynski is not just a national threat, but a fundamental threat to the entire European project. With respect to Libya, the other thing I'd like to emphasize, the European Union is pursuing a hypocritical policy at this stage. It knows that it wouldn't dare send migrants forcibly back to Libya. The conditions there are deadly, nightmarish, and to force somebody back is a blatant violation of international law. So to pretend that they can do that indirectly by bolstering and training the Libyan Coast Guard to keep people in rather than pushing people back is basically a distinction without a difference. And it's time for this hypocrisy to end and for the European Union to find other ways to protect its border that don't involve directly or indirectly forcing people into the nightmarish conditions of Libyan detention. Your question on Britain, Human Rights Watch doesn't take a position on Brexit per se. We are concerned, first of all, about the rights of many people who have established lives in Britain under European Union rules. And I know this is the subject of the negotiations between the European Union and Britain, but as much as possible, people should be able to maintain established lives without new restrictions imposed on them simply because of Brexit. We're also frankly concerned about some of the rhetoric of the Brexiteers, which is not only anti-European Union, but also anti-European Convention for Human Rights. And there's a real tendency to demagogue the issue, to say, oh, if it weren't for that European Convention for Human Rights, we'd be able to get rid of terrorists or do this or that we want to do. And it's a very short-sighted approach. Britain doesn't have a constitution. The closest that it has to a constitution is the European Convention on Human Rights. And if it really is going to go so far as to pull out of that convention, as some Brexiteers suggest, it's going to leave Brits across the board in a much weaker position to see their rights respected.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions de la part des...
There are questions from the journalists here.
Merci.
The German press agency
have you seen any improvement in the human right in the treatment of migrants by Libyan authorities, whether in detention centres or elsewhere, over the course of the last year or so? And secondly, there's been moves by European governments to, particularly France, to take migrants or refugees out of Libya and treat their asylum requests in African countries. Do you see that as something that can be a significant contribution to addressing the human rights issues there? And final question, following on from the question about the UN Secretary General, have you any remarks about the decision of Zaid al-Hussein not to go for another term as a Human Rights Commissioner? Thank you.
On Libya, let me take your question in essence to say, what can the European Union do lawfully to address the flow of migrants from Libya? Because clearly sending them back directly or indirectly is wrong. One, as you suggest, is improve conditions within Libya. There may have been, sort of some modest improvements in some of the official detention centers, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think it's impossible to know at this stage what conditions are across the board in the many irregular detention facilities that the smugglers and the traffickers are maintaining. So at this point, I think it would be wrong to suggest that there was anything approaching a systematic improvement in conditions for the treatment of migrants in Libya. It is clearly anything that allows migrants in Libya to escape that nightmare is to be encouraged. And so I know President Macron and others have talked about, airlifting people out who want to go back to their own countries. By all means, that should be an option. We would like to see the ability to seek asylum in safer places than Libya. And so the idea of setting up asylum assessment centers in safe places in West Africa or elsewhere is to be encouraged, as long as that is not the exclusive route. In other words, people who still get to European shore must still have the right to seek asylum, but by all means provide other safe and legal avenues to Europe. And that would be a very important way of undermining the incentive for people to risk their lives going to Libya in the first place or getting on a rickety craft across the Mediterranean.
Juste pour ajouter sur le...
And something about the initiative by France in Niger and Chad. As long as this initiative is supervised by the HCR and the OPR, and we believe that it's an interesting solution. The idea would be, as Lofprod says, but France could use this legal and safe way more broadly. It would allow more asylum seekers to use it. For the time being, France has announced figures which are rather modest. Several dozens of people have arrived in France in this way. More asylum seekers could benefit from it. France should increase its capacity to carry out more initiatives of this type. Virginia, I'd like what are our ambitions? The interpreter can't hear the question. No mic. And the Rohingya, could you talk about the Rohingyas and the 2018 objectives?
Two questions. One in terms of what are our ambitions with respect to immigration in Europe, and second on what we're looking for with Rohingya. On Europe, I've already spoken quite a bit about Libya, so let me just talk about two other dimensions of the immigration problem. I mean, because the route from Turkey is quieter these days, we tend not to be thinking about it. But it's important to remember that something like 50,000 asylum seekers who had taken that route are stuck in Greece. And about a quarter to a third of them are stuck on the Greek islands with very rudimentary facilities in the midst of winter. And Europe had promised to resettle what at one point was probably close to 60,000 asylum seekers, and there's been very little keeping of that promise. Greece is obviously still in the midst of an economic crisis, and to impose this additional burden on Greece because nobody wants to do its part is wrong. So we'd like to see, while at this moment Libya is the focus, we shouldn't forget the Turkey to Greece route, which remains an ongoing sore. With respect to the Rohingya, I think many are aware that there is this agreement now between Bangladesh and Burma to supposedly start repatriating people in as soon as a week. It is utterly premature to have any forcible repatriation because there is just no evidence that conditions are secure in northern Rakhine State. I mean, the irony is, journalists are not allowed into Rakhine State. Human rights activists are not allowed to investigate and monitor conditions there. How can it possibly be safe there if the Burmese government won't let anybody in to see? So number one is let humanitarian agencies operate freely, let journalists in to inspect what is happening, let people go back home. Unfortunately, there have been 350 plus villages that have been burned, but it is way too early to talk about large-scale repatriation. And I think, frankly, the only way that we're going to get the army to acquiesce in the steps needed to make it safe to return is through targeted economic sanctions. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think the international community has been wrong to wait for Aung San Suu Kyi to signal that this is what she wants, because she's never going to take that position. She doesn't want to cross the army, but more to the point, she does not want to stand up for the Rohingya. She has not said a word in support of them, and indeed it seems as if she doesn't believe the countless press and human rights accounts of the atrocities committed against the Rohingya. So in that situation of denial and lack of political courage, Aung San Suu Kyi is not the leader the world should look to for guidance on how to respond to the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. And what is needed now is serious pressure on Burmese military leaders to allow for the secure conditions that must precede any large-scale repatriation.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions de la part des journalistes?
Any other questions by the reporters in the room?
I just want to thank everybody, but I'll let you do the closing.
So I think I would just remind you that Philippe Dam would be able to answer any questions about Central Europe and the issue of immigration within the European Union. And he would also answer your question about the situation in Greece, especially on the Greek islands, because he's working a lot on the migrant questions who are stuck on the Greek islands. Bruno Stagno, especially on the topics, and you can do the interview in Spanish. And if you're interested on the issue of Central America and South America as well, and Emo and Andrew, who can also answer your questions about the fake news, media, and the rise of populism. So thank you everybody, and I will leave the concluding word to Ken.